recently discovered this one weird trick. How can you get almost 1,000 DDD people all in the same place at the same time? You tell them, we're going to talk about boundaries, bounded contexts, aggregates, subdomains, read model, write model, domain layer, application layer, infrastructure layer. It goes on and on. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But I've also got another trick to share with you. This one's about you personally. Like, how could you end up as a keynote speaker at DDD EU? So last year, I did a hands-on session, and I wore this stupid hat. And this year, I'm back as a keynote speaker. I'm just trying to work out what was going on there, and I'm just imagining Matthias and Annika in that evil supervillain cave, and they're going through the spreadsheets, and it's like, oh dear, we spent all of our money on orange post-it notes in the open bar. How are we going to get a final keynote speaker? Do you remember that guy with a stupid hat? Yeah, he'll do it, he'll do it. Here we are. So let's talk about boundaries. So not just in DDD, but in the world, in everything, we're always trying to take things, break them down into small pieces. A book is broken down into chapters. We think of the world as a bunch of countries, days broken into hours, and obviously in software systems, we're breaking them into services, or not. Depends whose blog you read the most. But why do we do this? What are the benefits here of making systems more modular, in the general sense of modularity, of taking something big and breaking it into small pieces? The first one is about comprehensibility or cognitive load. Can I reason about something in isolation or explain it in isolation without having to explain a bunch of other stuff? Imagine you wanted to change one line of code and you had to load the entire code base, millions of lines of code in your head at the same time. It just doesn't work. Second one is about evolution, evolving things in parallel. Often this is at the team level. Teams can work in isolation autonomously. From a business perspective, we can also make more granular investments. If we break things into small pieces, we can spend 80% of our time here, 20% of our time here, and not have dependencies watering down those investments. We also have granular customizability. I can do things differently in different modules. If they're all the same, it's probably not possible to do that. And the final one is containment. So if we have things going a bit messy in one place, they don't spread into other places. If one thing blows up at runtime, it doesn't affect other things. But actually, I don't know if there are 5 now. Maybe there's a 6th one. What do you think? Reuse? Who likes reuse? Who's built a DDD framework before? I'm not saying anything about reuse. Just going to leave it there. But let's think about how these things apply in the real world. So here's Europe, some of Europe. Top left-hand corner, let's not go there today. But I can explain to you the concept of Switzerland. I can tell you things about Switzerland without having to tell you about France and Germany and surrounding countries. Switzerland itself as a country can apply granular customizability. They can have their own rules and laws and ways of living. Like, they like to have referendums, and they're good at it. Let's not do that everywhere, okay? Not a great thing to do. But what I find really interesting is that when we talk about boundaries, when we talk about breaking things down into modules, I think we overemphasize the boundaries a lot. I think the concept of boundaries itself implies a hard split between things. But I really don't think the world works that way, or even software. And I think this is why language is the core of DDD and bounded context, because language is having an impact on all of these things. I'm not picking on Switzerland. I like Switzerland. My wife is Swiss. Any Swiss people here? Okay, a few. So in Switzerland, they speak 4 languages. So they actually don't speak Swiss, even though they say they do. They speak other languages. And in the west of Switzerland, they speak French. Now, if you go to that part of Switzerland, you'll obviously notice a big French influence, because the language is the same. They watch French TV channels. They read French books. And when I speak to people from here, they often say, yeah, it's easier for us to travel to France because we speak the same language than to travel to Zurich, where they speak Swiss German. So even though there's a boundary here around Switzerland, there's a huge influence from France because the language is the same. And that's why I think understanding language better is key to really understanding boundaries. Because we need to understand how much influence is coming from outside the boundary, inside the boundary. And it's usually language that carries that influence. But language is very confusing. JavaScript contains no Java. Strawberries contain no straw. I was really disappointed as a kid to find this out. Like, I don't care, Santa's not real. I'm sorry if I spoiled that for anyone. But you tell me there's no straw in strawberries. I didn't come out of my room for like a week. Flammable and inflammable, they sound like opposites, but they mean the same thing. 1 mouse and 2 mouses. No, 2 mice. What's going on here? What's the rule for pluralization? Turns out the rules are a bit complicated. It's not quite so simple. And then we have homonyms, homophones, things that share some similarities. What's the common link between these two things? Rock. Okay, that was just a starting one to get you started. Let's try another one. What's the relationship between these two things? Fairy. But if you're a non-native speaker and you hear someone saying words that are that close, you're going to think they're saying the same thing when they mean hugely different things. And let's look at how words change over time. So we have this concept of shipping. I can go onto the website of a courier and I can ship something from one side of New York to the other. Is that going to be on a huge container ship? Imagine you're waiting for an Amazon delivery. You get a knock at your door. You open your door and there's this huge ship. Here's your book. No, shipping doesn't mean that. In the 1800s in America, they changed this word to mean delivering things by other channels and techniques like railroads. America in the 1800s, we're going to come back to that in a minute. Something was going on in that period of time. We're going to come back to it. But first, let's think about context. You might think a word has a very clear meaning, but when you read a word, you're applying context to understand what does that word mean in this particular situation it's being used in. Drunk gets 9 months in a violin case. Next time someone says, let's build a DDD framework, point to the violin case. Okay. Queen Mary having bottom scraped. It's really not a good time to be the UK royal family at the moment, the British royal family. They're having a real hard time, so let's let this one slide. Students cook and serve grandparents. Who's done that before? You wish. Fruit or vegetable? Who says tomato is a fruit? Who says tomato is a vegetable? Of course it's a fruit, because science says so. But let's go back to America in the 1800s. So in the 1800s in America, they had a rule, a tax. If you import vegetables, you pay a tax on them. So people started importing lots of tomatoes, so they didn't have to pay tax. And then the US Supreme Court said, hey, science, take the day off. We're reclassifying tomatoes as vegetables so we can charge tax on them. So what we can learn here is really why the concept of a bounded context is a linguistic boundary. Because even when we think words can have a very precise meaning, for all kinds of reasons, in different contexts, they can have hugely different meanings. Even when a word has a very clear and precise and scientifically defined meaning, the United States of America might have a different definition. I'm just kidding, I like the States really. And there's actually another reason for language. And I think this might be the main reason DDD people like language, because we like complaining. Language allows us to complain. So my point here is, I think we talk about bounded contexts as linguistic boundaries, which they are, but I think we overemphasize the boundary and we underemphasize the linguistic bit. I think there's a lot more influence here from outside the boundary than we really understand and expect. And I think we need to start understanding the domain model of language and bringing that into domain-driven design. So now I want to talk about a different aspect of bounded contexts. So bounded contexts are defined by language. We look for models, we look for specific terminology where it has specific meanings, and we put a boundary around it. But that's not the only thing about bounded contexts. What's the purpose of a bounded context? A bounded context plays a role in your business model. It's there serving a purpose to enable some aspect of your business model. And so quite clearly, if you don't understand your business model, you can't design good bounded context, because every trade-off we make, every trade-off, engineering trade-off, has business impacts. What are you optimizing for on a strategic and a day-to-day basis when you're making trade-offs? What business impacts are you optimizing for? If you don't know the goal, you can't choose the most appropriate trade-off. And so in domain-driven design, we have this concept of core, supporting, and generic subdomains, which I think also applies to bounded context. But one of the issues I've noticed is that these terms are a little imprecise and hard to pin down and hard to quantify, and everything's the core domain. So how can we make this more quantifiable? When someone says everything's the core domain, that's okay. Just say which is more core than something else. So I think that wasn't even a joke. I think these two axes are the ones I've taken away from the book. To be our core domain, there needs to be some high level of business differentiation. The amount of effort we apply in this place, the payback is greater than somewhere else. But there's also complexity. If adding more complexity to our solution doesn't increase the payback and a simple CRUD system will suffice, that can't really be our core domain. So let's take a look at some patterns here. So if we have something which is complex and super high business differentiation, this is some kind of decisive core. This really is your core. This is where, if you do this properly, if you get an advantage here, you can dominate a market, you can be the clear market leader or have an edge, a big edge in a certain area. And because the complexity is high, the ability for your competitors to catch up is harder because a significant investment is required to reach that level. Something else about core domains. There's this phrase I hear a lot. What's core may change over time. No, that's not how things work. What's core will change over time, all the time, constantly changing. Evolution is a given. We should always be thinking what's coming next, what's coming next, what's coming next, and trying to anticipate the future. And with this model, we can. So we can say, if we've got our core domain, which is super high business differentiation, the business are saying it's down here, but yet the software solution is very simple. This doesn't match up. How can you get high differentiation in something which is so simple your competitors can catch up very easily? You're probably missing something here. Examples I've seen are, like in government, for example, we'll be doing a digital transformation. We'll take this old paper-based form and we'll turn it into a web page that looks exactly like the paper. No, we missed a chance here. We missed the chance to take all of these manual processes, all of these spreadsheets, and turn them into software and gain more advantage here. Another pattern is the first-to-market core, I like to call it. We did it first, we got high differentiation, but because the complexity is low, the competition will have this feature in 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. It's not a defensible position. We need to be thinking, what's coming next? What's coming next? Another way of thinking about core domains is we think there's huge potential here. This could be a significant revenue stream in the future, but we don't know yet, and it's high complex, and we need a big investment up front. And so the mindset is different. The mindset is going from, this is making money, let's try and make more, to this could make money, we need to do more discovery and apply different ways of working here. We then have former cores. So something that used to be your core domain is now table stakes. The point here is, if we can anticipate something's going to be table stakes, even though it's core now, are we planning for a future where it's not the core? How do we invest our time over that period? We also have what I would call a black swan core. Things that we didn't expect to happen. Things that shouldn't have happened. Things that have no idea. And this is where I have a bit of a conflict with DDD when people say, outsource all the generic things, buy them off the shelf. There's a lot of truth here, but sometimes what's generic can become your core domain. It really is possible. It doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. And so we had a meetup in London, last week, and I dropped this line. I'm like, there are no generic domains. And in a way, I don't think there are. I think anything, new innovations can happen anywhere, at any time. We have to make a bet on, do we think this is no possibility here for this to become a core domain? Anyone use Slack? Anyone know the story of Slack? So Slack as a company, before it was Slack, they were a company who made video games, not too successfully. And I think the company was almost done, bankrupt, out of money, about to shut down. But for some reason, they built their own internal chat system. I mean, at the time, why would you do that? We have IRC, Skype, all those kind of messengers. Why would you build your own chat system? But they did it. And when the company wasn't succeeding, they said, why don't we turn that internal chat system into a product? Fast forward a few years, $13 billion. Not bad for a generic domain we should have outsourced. Looking at the supporting aspect, we can also ask questions here. If something has a fairly low level of business differentiation, but it's extremely complex, this is a warning sign. Why are we doing this? Maybe we have too much accidental complexity here. Maybe we've over-engineered the solution. And maybe that time could have been spent focusing on our core domains. And of course, the most common, the most prevalent type of core domain is the CEO or some manager's pet project, which is extremely complex, takes a huge amount of time, offers no business value, and needs to be flushed down the toilet very quickly. We can also take this approach when we think about monolith to microservices. So if something is easy to migrate and has a high level of value after migration, perhaps we want to innovate here, and we can innovate faster once it's pulled out the monolith. We've got the low-hanging fruits. In the top left-hand corner, where it's complex to migrate and there's low value, we've got the last toothpaste in the tube. You know, when you're like rolling it up and squeezing it. and it's hard to get out, the same amount of value is just incredibly much more difficult to get out of the tube. And then we have the interesting bits. We have to decide, are we going to be risk-seeking here, or are we going to be risk-averse? Do we want something that has higher value and is more complex to migrate, or something which is simpler but gives us less benefit once it's migrated? And it's not a binary choice. We're looking at this axis and deciding how far across this diagonal do we want to go. It's a choice here. Very often when I see the monolith to microservices thing, people are talking in extremes. Let's do something simple. Let's do something complex. Let's plot them all on a chart and decide where do we feel the most appropriate choices. Another thing I hear about core domains is follow the money. Just follow the money to find your core domains. But that's not always true, because it's not always what makes your money that differentiates you. Let's take the example of search. How many people use a search engine because it has the most amazing adverts? No, no one. How many people use a search engine because you get relevant search results? Okay. Where's the core domain here? I don't actually know where the core domain is there, but it's an example. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about this business evolution stuff too much more, but I've noticed on the schedule there are a couple of other talks who are going to talk about Wardley mapping, and I highly recommend learning about Wardley mapping and attending these sessions if you get the opportunity. So, something else I'd like to talk about, another aspect of bounded context, is thinking about the organization of the teams. There's a lot of interesting dynamics here, and I don't think, in fact, I'm pretty sure as an industry we haven't really figured out how to do teams properly yet. We still seem to have the same debates, simplified models, etc. But what's interesting is we have some research and data we can work with to guide us. So Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, Gene Kim, they've been doing those DevOps surveys now for, I don't know, 6 years or something, and I launched a book, I think it was last year or the year before. And I was actually surprised myself, because what they found is one of the biggest predictors of continuous delivery performance, which they reckon correlates with organizational performance, is a loosely coupled software architecture and an organizational structure to match. I'd have been happy to see that in the book, but when they're saying it's the most important thing, wow, pretty surprising. But why is that? What is the underlying model that can explain these numbers, these symptoms, these patterns we see? So here's my mental model. Let's see what you think. So in an organization, we have teams. The goal of a team is to understand what are we trying to build here. We look for signals from the market. We talk to customers, we place bets. And what's the market looking for? As a consumer, what are we looking for? We're looking for products with a great customer experience. This doesn't mean a pretty website that has fancy widgets and animations. For example, I use British Airways, and I couldn't access my orders for like 2 months. Great website, awful customer experience, because these systems just aren't joined up together. What enables that great customer experience is the software architecture, the way we've shaped our system, the way things interact. If I can't see my orders on the web page, the architecture is not working here. And this is a loop. So the architecture is developed by the teams. So if we want to go through this cycle faster of finding what the market wants, delivering it, we need the architecture in the right shape, and we need the teams in the right shape to build that. And we actually know from Conway's law that there's a relationship between the shape of the organization and the shape of the software architecture. Now, what is the software architecture? It's a model of the domain. So this is my mental model at the moment. There's something going on here between these three concepts. They're all related. So when we talk about bounded context and DDD, I don't know if it's possible to distinguish these three things. I think there's a real high relationship between all of them. And so we know the business is evolving over time, what's core is changing over time. And so we need to be evolving the architecture and teams so we're in the best position to have high flow in terms of changes on those core domains. So I've recently been reading a book called Team Topologies. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in there. Wow. He's surprised I can read. I'm surprised myself. My family gave up on me when I was 5 years old, so I made it. So in the book, they talk about 3 kinds of collaboration patterns. They talk about, well, one is collaboration, 2 or more teams working closely together. Talk about X as a service. One team builds a service, provides it to another, but there's minimal collaboration here. And they also talk about facilitation, which is one team is helping another. And so just having this simplified model helps us to think about what kind of relationship should we be having between different teams at different times. So if we've identified a core domain, we've validated the opportunity, we have a clear roadmap, and we're trying to innovate quickly, we want to be using X as a service here. We don't want the core domain teams to be collaborating if there's no need for that collaboration. Maybe there's a warning sign. On the other hand, if we're exploring some kind of big bet core domain and the work needs to cut across multiple teams, we don't want to use a service here, X as a service here. We want to have collaboration because we want to validate ideas faster and be able to have end-to-end slices of all of these pieces in place so we can innovate quickly and validate this idea. And if you start looking at these patterns and playing what if and playing with combinations, you can find some interesting things like, why would we go from collaborating to X as a service? Once we validate the idea, don't need collaboration anymore. We could go collaborating X as a service and facilitating. Why would we do this? 2 teams work together. They build this standard contract between them, but then we have lots of work in one team. Because the other team helped them to define that contract, they can go and support them in the short term. Then we can go from helping them to no interaction. That's okay. Just because you're collaborating with a team or helping them this week or next week, it doesn't mean you're bound together for life in a 3-legged race. And maybe we've got this clearly defined interface between 2 bounded contexts, and we don't need our teams to collaborate. But then we find some new innovation which does require collaboration. Just because we're distant from them now doesn't mean we can't collaborate in future. There are no rules here about once you've collaborated, you can't stop, or vice versa. What we can also do is to start asking, how are we investing based on where we think the value is? So we think our core is over here, and we've got 8 people on it. And we've got 14 people on our supporting. Does that make sense? There's not a matchup here. What we can see then is probably we've got lots of accidental complexity in our supporting context here. If we can reduce that accidental complexity, we can have double the amount of people almost working on our core domains. We can also start asking questions about how do we group teams. There's a really interesting dynamic here. If we have 2 teams working in more of a discovery area and they're validating ideas, that's a different mindset to I've got a roadmap and I'm delivering stuff. But then we have dependencies between core and supporting. How would we group the teams here? By dependency or by the type of work they're doing? There's probably a whole bunch of stuff inside here we need to investigate and think about to make that decision. What I've also noticed is that sometimes we think about coupling and cohesion as very simple, intrinsic properties of a system, but they're really not. You can have the perfect boundaries, highly autonomous teams for weeks or months, and then something totally new gets added to your roadmap, and suddenly you've got dependencies between all of your teams. Because coupling is based on what's changing in the business, not concepts in software. So while there is an element of cohesion in domains, like we talked about earlier with language, things outside the boundary are influencing things inside the boundary. There's still a relationship there. So we need a less simplified model of coupling. But the way we organize our teams, the way we organize our people, there's actually some freedom, some flexibility here. It's very difficult to take one piece of an architecture, split it off and move it somewhere else for a whole number of reasons. But people, we're a bit more fluid. How can we exploit these opportunities? So if we have a big bet core domain, which cuts across multiple teams, we could do the collaboration thing across multiple teams, or we could take people from each of those teams with the expertise, form a short-term team, an expedition team perhaps. They validate this idea, and then they go back to their original teams. Or we can try some kind of rotation, which I'm seeing quite common now. We have one larger team with multiple teams inside it. Each team has a fixed technical lead, or maybe a couple of fixed people, and then some rotation happens on a periodic basis, maybe one person per month. That was the one I saw last, one person per month. As a side note, I always found this really interesting when I was working in this relationship to rotate between teams, learning from different people, working on different parts of the domain, helps me understand the bigger picture. But there are some caveats here. Some people don't like to rotate. Some people form relationships with their colleagues. They like working together. So I'm not saying do this everywhere. I'm saying consider this, think about this, but let people have a say before you do it. There's a company I've spent some time with in the UK called Redgate Software. They're doing a lot of awesome things. And one of the things they talked about recently on their blog is team self-selection. Here's a bunch of work that needs to get done. You're the people building it. Go organize yourselves, form your own teams, work with who you want to work with, work how you want to work. How amazing is that? And sometimes it's not doing the work that we need to think about. Sometimes it's in there's complexity in the organization, and we need to reduce that complexity, not the software complexity. So this team has awful APIs. They don't work. They're always buggy. We spent 3 months building a huge data importer, and now we have 1 million data consistency issues. Can you hack a new feature so we don't have to talk to the other team? Can we just bypass them? We're going to build this system in a totally unique technology stack so the other team can't integrate with us, so they can't work with us, so we can protect our power and our status in the company. All of these things are real. So to conclude this topic, I want to recommend 3 books to you. First one is Team Topologies. Second one is Dynamic Reteaming. And don't forget, if you never made it there, there's a whole bunch of this stuff in the DDD book at the end. All of those conformist, customer supplier, all of those relationship patterns are extremely relevant to what we're doing. And maybe they're underutilized. And maybe there are a whole bunch of other patterns we just haven't discovered yet. Bounded context DNA. I don't remember putting this slide in. What am I going to talk about now? So one thing I've noticed a lot, had this conversation the other night too, is that when we talk about designing bounded context, there's a huge pattern of, I don't know how I chose that bounded context. It just felt right. I've designed lots of systems, I work with lots of companies, and I look at an architecture and I see the solution. Yeah, that's great. How can I teach that to like a junior or the people who want to learn DDD? I can't take your brain, extract these feelings, and put them in someone else's brain. So in the 90s, there was the Human Genome Project. And after this project, actually this project was a really unique project. Do you know why? Because they finished early and under budget. It was also interesting for a few other reasons. They identified lots of patterns in human DNA, and that enabled them to have high-level insights. So you can trace your ancestry. You can identify what diseases might you be susceptible to. And here's some of mine, actually. So I'm not 100% British. I've got a bit of French and German in there. Apparently, I'm likely to be 6% under the average weight. Don't know where the other 40%'s gone, but there's a lot missing. So I've been trying to think about all the aspects of a bounded context, like what are the building blocks, what are the concepts, what are the pieces, and then once I get there, I'm going to try and work out what are these feelings people have, what relationships are they seeing when they look at a system. So I'm not going to go through all of this now, but we've looked at some, even just the description. When you say to two people, do you understand this context? They'll both say yeah, and then you say, can you write it down then as like a 2 or 3 sentence elevator pitch? And one person will write it down and the other person will disagree. So just that simple thing, but we've looked at strategic classification, we've got decisions in there, we've got the language in there, we've got dependencies, relationships, we've got commands, events, queries. There's probably a lot more to go in here, but this is my current understanding. Is this the DNA? Is there more to discover? I don't know. Let's start the Bounded Context Genome Project. But actually, this project began in 2004, actually, just after the Human Genome Project finished. So maybe Eric Evans was working on that project, and then he worked on this project. Because he talked about this pattern of bubble context. What he was telling us is, hey, there are patterns in these bounded contexts. Some of them do similar things. They have similar purposes. And I think what he was trying to say is, bounded contexts are like lemmings. They have specific roles and purposes you can assign to them. You build a bridge, you burn through things, you walk off the cliff, oh sorry. So if we've got bubble contexts, what other characteristics and relationships and patterns and roles and responsibilities might be hiding in there? Alberto Brandolini talks about having 3 distinct kinds of archetypes. We've got a draft. We build up some proposal. We then have a specific context which is about executing or managing the execution of a process. And we have something else which is observing the process, collecting information, and possibly applying some analytics here. So this helps us to already think about what kind of context are we dealing with. If we see multiple of these things in there, that's a sign. That's an intrinsic feeling. Oh, I'm sensing draft and execute here. Let's split those things. Maybe they're a separate model. We have different kinds of pipelines. We have pipelines which can be a linear process. We have pipelines like a proposal pipeline where we have this proposal and it's going through stages, but at some point in the process, an outside trigger can happen which invalidates something that happened before, and we have to restart the process again. We have concepts like a funnel pipeline, where we have information coming in from multiple sources. They're standardized in one and passed along the pipeline from there. What are the characteristics of these patterns and how do we identify them and choose them? Another one I've noticed is like the OCTOPUS Enforcer, where we have some element of compliance here, like GDPR, for example. I want all of my context, all of my microservices to conform to specific policies because there's a significant business risk if we don't here. So with this pattern, we have this centralized service. It's a process manager. It sends out commands to all of the other services and says, do this. Delete all of this customer's data. But why a command and not an event? Because we want a specific record. I told you to do this. I got a response. I know you heard me. You now have 3 days to do this, and if you don't, I'm going to trigger the emergency process. We also have some anti-patterns, which I'm sure you've seen before, where we have one context. It's not always the rules engine, but I'm going to pick on rules engines because all of the complexity resides in this one context. Whenever you want to change anything in one of the other contexts, you always have to change the rules context, the rules engine. Other patterns are about the way information flows in and out of the system, like on the edge of a system. So a gateway is something that lives on the edge, managing data coming in or out or both. An interchange context, Eric already defined this some years ago, is a context which translates from one language to another. So a gateway interchange context sits on the edge of your system, manages all these different languages coming in, standardizes them, and sends a command to the context inside your system. Why a command and why not an event here? The reason we want to use a command here is because information coming in from outside the system is owned by a single context. The location of a vehicle is owned by the location context. If you want a vehicle's location, you should go to the location context to get that. If we publish an event here, any other context can get that raw data, and this may cause problems. If the location context needs to do some processing fuzzy GPS data, if you don't go to location context, you might get invalid positions when the car hasn't actually moved. This is another pattern. Enterprise integration patterns is quite an old book now, but it has a bunch of these lower level patterns. And this language works. This is extremely useful. I think about these patterns a lot. What's the next level on top of this? We don't need to get to a fully specified patterns language, but I'm pretty sure there's another level on top of this that we can start thinking about. Another one is mapper context, when I don't want my generic components coupled to my domain, but how do I have, if there's an event inside the domain, and I want something to happen outside the domain, how do I manage that without the coupling? I can have a mapper. It maps a domain event inside the domain to an action outside the domain, like sending an email, for example. MATHIAS, he's got this concept of ghost contexts. Have a read of his blog, see what he means. And with all of these patterns, with all of these processes, like we talked about earlier, we're thinking about business processes, but there's a three-way relationship: the domain, the architecture, and the teams. So all of these patterns have social technical implications too. So with this pattern, if we see a pattern like this in our domain, we have one context which has many consumers, and they're all using a standard interface. We know it's going to be very painful to change that interface. We need to do some good design work up front to try and design an interface that won't change. And when it does change, it's going to be very painful. You know, you get those emails. You still haven't upgraded to the version 4 of Team A's service yet. Yeah, I know, because our roadmap is huge. Meanwhile, this team is just going crazy because they can't delete the old version. So MATHIAS has some messaging patterns on his blog. I'm not going to talk about those for now, but again, starting to see some patterns here, starting to document people's intuition. So we don't need to have expert knowledge. We can start absorbing this much sooner. And so if I think about bounded context, if I try and dissect them, what's going on inside there? There's certainly a linguistic component for sure. There's a business component for sure. Is it core? Is it supporting? Is it generic? How does that impact what's going on in here? There's a socio-technical component, definitely. I think that relationship's there. And then there's some more DNA stuff, which I don't think we've figured out yet, which we're starting to try and document now. So I think that's an interesting area. And obviously we have continuous pressures from outside the context trying to influence it for all of these reasons, for business reasons, for socio-technical reasons, for domain reasons. And the boundaries are actually porous. There's stuff coming through these boundaries, either in the social space or the language is changing. It's not a hard physical boundary. We need to be understanding that things are coming in and out. There's influence happening here, and we need to be on top of that. So you're probably bored of me now, so I think I peaked way too early with that one joke. All downhill from there. So I'm just going to finish with a few predictions and opportunities. So I think at the moment, software is, there's a big gap between the software explaining how the domain works. And I think because the software we're building is representing the domain, it should be screaming to me how the domain works. And I don't think we've got there yet. And I think the domain language we use should be clearer from the code. And so I think we need to start thinking about language concepts. And how can we bring that closer to the code we're writing? So one of the reasons we need to have stable, long-lived teams is because the ramp-up costs of learning a new code base, understanding a new part of the domain. What if we can delete that constraint and make it easier to onboard into a new context? Suddenly we've got huge organizational benefits because we're more fluid in that space. And so living documentation is something that's really talking to me at the moment. Cyril wrote this book, but I think he wrote this book too early. I don't think we've really understood how important this concept is and what software systems in the future will look like. I think that's the way we're going. And then, taking our understanding of a bounded context and somehow encoding that into the system. So when I open your code base, it tells me everything I need to know about this bounded context. It contains these policies, has these dependencies, publish these events. And actually, we can do even more than that. Think about when you go into work with a new company or you start with a new team and you say to me, tell me how your architecture works, and they start drawing boxes and lines on a whiteboard. We have all of this code information in systems, and it can't tell us its shape and structure and what it looks like. We really are such an advanced group of the way we work. So I think the opportunity here is we start to define, what do we mean by a bounded context? Which are the properties we care about? How can we make these things explicit in our system so that the system tells us about these things? And then once we get to that stage, we can start identifying these patterns, seeing how systems change over time, and the tooling will tell us, this thing is going away, it used to be your core, it's now moving here. Maybe you want to shift your design in this way. It's all gut feeling and instinct at the moment. I think also the language around patterns and processes and different kinds of business processes, I don't really think we have anything here, but there are specific kinds of processes you see in different companies, different shapes and topologies and flows. And again, I think that's another intuition thing. People just work in lots of different companies. They see these different patterns and they know what are the pros and cons and trade-offs. It's just an inherent feeling. How can we make these things explicit so they're much easier for newcomers to learn and apply? One other prediction I have is about how we measure the performance and the value of a bounded context. So I've seen recently with serverless now, you get real-time, accurate updates about how much it costs to run your serverless function. And obviously your bounded context can be a group of functions. Imagine if we can tie in the benefits this context is having. So here's how much benefit it's providing. Here's how much it's costing to run. We can make massive strategic predictions and planning based on this, and there's a huge opportunity there. And I think also the socio-technical architecture, I really feel that when we start talking about organizing teams, we don't have anything here. We don't really have any patterns or principles. We have a few simple models. And so that's why I'm excited by team topologies and dynamic reteaming. We can leverage the fluidity of the organization more. There's a lot to be discovered here. And I think because the domain, the architecture, and the organization is so, there are relationships there. Maybe we're the community that can be thinking about these things, incorporating it more into DDD. And this prediction, it's not much of a prediction because it's going to happen basically. It's already happening. Think about the evolution of a programmer. I'm pretty sure most of you are doing more businessy domain-focused work now than when you became a programmer. The big cloud vendors are automating away all of their infrastructural tasks, and we're doing more domain-focused, product-focused work. Just think in 5 or 10 years, do you think that trend will stop or continue? I don't think it will stop. I don't think it will go backwards. I think it can only go forwards. So, yeah, we're going to become more domain experts in the future. And we already have research telling us this. The best source of product ideas is talking to your customer, and the second best source is the whole team brainstorming the ideas. The people building the system, having domain knowledge, huge competitive advantage. If we know this is an advantage, we're not going to ignore it. We're going to go towards this. And so, what about DDD? We had the first 15 years. Lots of innovations here, event storming, event sourcing. We then had the book, the 15 years book last year. You've all had 1 year to read this amazing book with all these great essays. Now it's time to think about the next 15 years. I don't think we're finished with DDD yet. I think there's like huge opportunity here. So, I'll leave you with this. Have a great conference.